Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Richard Norton Smith, the author of An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. This is his 10th book. He has been the director of the Hoover, Eisenhower, Reagan, Ford, and Lincoln presidential libraries, and is a renowned public speaker and has appeared on C-SPAN even more times than Chuck Schumer. I made that up, but good to have you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your interest.
Before we start our interview,
don't tell Senator Schumer.
That's right. Yeah, we don't have to tell. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Gerald Ford's is the fifth shortest presidential administration, and the shortest if you don't include those who died in office. But Richard argues the impact that Ford left is much more substantial than that factoid would suggest. Richard says, you say, that he guided the nation through the worst constitutional crisis since the Civil War and got the economy moving again. And you also write that he is unlucky to be surrounded, chronologically at least, by the dramas of JFK and LBJ and Nixon, and then on the other side by Ronald Reagan, who just seemed to swallow up the legacies of both Ford and Carter. So, Richard, when and how did you decide that one of our shortest presidential terms needed a fresh but lengthy tome?
Well, I don't know about lengthy, but certainly fresh. I did not intend it to be 800 pages.
And here you are.
The fact that it is 800 pages and that it took 10 years to do is itself a kind of testament to what I uncovered, which in the end justified 800 pages. If Ford were just another president, let alone someone who many people regard as an accidental president, who was there for 2 years. And to be honest with you, there are a lot of folks in my generation who, when you mention the name Gerald Ford, think of Chevy Chase and a stumble bump on Saturday Night Live. Ford himself went to his grave in 2006, believing, and I thought at the time he was right, that his historical legacy would be boiled down into his efforts to try to restore some semblance of trust in the American presidency and government more generally in the wake of Watergate, but also Vietnam. We tend to forget. I mean, a whole decade before Ford became president, this country had been in turmoil. Some of it constructive turmoil, and some of it destructive turmoil. And the irony is that this not terribly well-known, sort of vanilla congressman from West Michigan, who never wanted to be president, whose lifelong goal was to be Speaker of the House, and who had both the strengths and the weaknesses, quite frankly, of 25 years on Capitol Hill. Someone that in some ways, frankly, suggests parallels with the current president. I mean, Ford was, I used to tell him he was charismatically challenged. And it was typical Ford that he would laugh. He had a rare quality. He had the ability to laugh at himself. And there are plenty of examples of that throughout the book. Anyway, the point is, in 2006, the consensus was what Ford thought, that he would be remembered for, if you will, cleaning up the misses. Not only Watergate, but Vietnam. People forget we were still very much involved in Southeast Asia when he became president. But also remember the rogue CIA, that underwent extensive investigation and some measure of reform after that. All right. Ford is a classic example. Harry Truman is another one who illustrates that sometimes it takes 20, 30, 40 years to pass before you can begin to assess a president in a larger sense. So instead of just the president who cleaned up messes, the fact is, and one reason why this book is 800 pages, is because what Ford started is probably more important historically than what he cleaned up. Give two quick examples. One is economic deregulation, which he shrewdly didn't want to call it economic deregulation. He wanted to call it regulatory reform. Try to tell someone in Generation X that there was a time not so long ago when Washington bureaucrats decided where planes could fly and what trucks could carry and where you could get a home mortgage. I mean, all of that was swept away. And it began under Ford, who basically deregulated the railroads and the financial services industry, which means, but next time you go to an ATM machine, tip your hat to Gerald Ford. On the global scene, in the summer of 1975, he went to Helsinki, and in the face of strident criticism from both the right and the left, he signed something called the Helsinki Accords, which at the time were seen in this country as a concession to the Soviet Union, a legitimization, if you will, of their post-World War II empire in Eastern Europe. Now, after the Cold War, we understand them in a very different light, because what Helsinki did was to plant the seeds of resistance in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union itself. I mean, there are a number of other examples, but those are two examples that I think everyone can relate to, which go to this point that historical assessment is something that is constantly being rewritten, not least of all because now we can compare how Gerald Ford handled the Middle East or Soviet relations with how his successors handled those very same issues.
You were head of the Ford Presidential Library, and you were friends with him. That's a disclaimer, I guess. But you even gave the eulogy, which is unbelievable. And I have more questions about that later. But you gave a eulogy to the former president. What a moment that must have been for you. And I'm going to ask about that. But how did you create enough distance between your personal relationship with him and the man and the president and all the politics that comes along with it to do a fair book?
And that is the definitive question. I asked myself that a lot. And I talked to people. I remember I knew, because I'd been doing this for 30 years at that point, and I'd written a number of books about people who, in a sense, I might admire, but who I also understood for biography or history to have any credibility. Remember something David Kennerly, the great Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer who was a virtual member of the Ford family, he said, if you're not critical, you're not credible. And because I knew Ford, and Mrs. Ford too, because her story is very much a part of this story, because I knew them as well as I did, I was confident that they would expect a critical, in the broadest sense of the word, hopefully credible biography. But I was still unconvinced. I mean, people who I know, Doris Kearns Goodwin, who actually was my thesis advisor in college, or John Meacham. I mean, there's a couple of people who have written objective, big biographies about people whom they knew intimately, and yet they were able to maintain exactly the kind of detachment that you're describing. So I remember having lunch with David McCullough. I don't mean to name drop, but I was
well, you got three big ones in there plus Ford, so you're doing good there. Yeah.
No, I had lunch with David McCullough at his beloved Hay Adams across from the White House, and I brought this quandary up, and I'll never forget. He said, "Write about what you know." And the great irony of that, of course, is that I spent the next 10 years learning all the things I didn't know, or unlearning the things I thought I knew.
Yeah. So give us an idea of how much material, even just 2.5, and just briefly here, just so we get a sense of what you went through. 2.5 years of a president, it sounds minuscule compared to 8 years that someone might serve. How much material does that amount of time in office produce?
That's another great question. I'd been director, as you said, of 5 presidential libraries, including the Ford, and I was not prepared for the sheer volume of documentation that a modern presidency generates. Just to give you a comparison, forget numbers. There is more paper in the Gerald Ford Library than there is in the Franklin Roosevelt Library. That's almost all you need to know.
That's astonishing. Yeah.
It is astonishing.
12 years versus 2.5.
The advantage that I had was because just the timing. I mean, I'll give you a specific example of what sort of flavors this book. I was the first person outside the family to see Gerald Ford's baby book. And there's this very poignant entry, baby's first automobile ride. Well, it turns out baby's first automobile ride occurred when he was 2 weeks old, 2 days after his father, who was not named Gerald Ford, was named Leslie King, walked into his wife's bedroom with a butcher knife, threatening to kill mother and child. And 2 days later, Dorothy, then King, later Ford, extraordinary woman, slipped out of the house and crossed the Mississippi to the Iowa side, took a train for Chicago. That was Gerald Ford's first automobile ride. If I hadn't, for example, had access. Now, why is that related to that? Closely related to that. There's a file of Dorothy King's divorce papers. Now, Gerald Ford could have destroyed those. Those were his. But he felt he had an obligation to history. And so basically the arrangement was he preserved all that. He turned it over to the library, and it would become available on his death. And so there was a vast amount of material, quite frankly, that was available to me just by happenstance that had not been available to earlier writers. But in addition to that, I did 170 interviews, new interviews, took about 3 years to do. And that, I think, is what gives the book its humanity. It's those stories. Because, quite frankly, the dirty little secret is that the history of the American presidency is not written down in official documents. I mean, there are millions and millions of, and they're useful, and you should go through many of them, but you won't find the essence of the president, those around him, the climate that he created in the White House, which is another reason why it sometimes takes years, even decades, for that material. The man who worked with Ford on his ghostwriter, frankly, a guy named Trevor Armbruster, he did 4,000 pages of interviews with Ford. Now, they have not been opened. However, I was able to see anything I wanted to see. But in addition to that, Armbruster did something really smart. With Ford's complete connivance, he went out and he interviewed 50 people, close friends, members of the cabinet, journalists, people who weren't necessarily, uncritical. And all of that material had been locked away with the understanding that it would never become public. Well, that key was turned, and I was able to have access to all of those who have died. Obviously, those who are still living, that's still under lock and key. But I mean, that's the kind of digging that you have to do, and it's another reason why it takes as long as it does.
Hearing you, just one quick anecdote that strikes me. I when you say that the history of the American presidency isn't written down, I thought of an anecdote from a recent book about Joe Biden that said the first time this guy who had walked into the Oval Office literally thousands of times before he became president, before it was his own office, the first thing he did, someone who witnessed it said he walked up to the desk and simply could not speak. And I thought, what an amazing anecdote that is, and a perfect illustration of something that just wouldn't be written down unless you interviewed somebody who said what it was like to be in the same room.
Yeah, absolutely. The first president that Ford knew was Harry Truman. Ford was a young congressman in 1949. Remember, the White House was about to fall down. And
right. Yeah, right. Quite literally. Yeah.
Literally. What
Yeah,
it was basically on its last legs. And there was a debate about, it would be easier and maybe cheaper to tear it down and build a new building. And Truman, who had a real sense of history, didn't want that to happen. But for that to happen, he had to persuade a Republican Congress to pony up $5 million. And he invited Ford, the lowest of the low in Washington, is a junior first-term congressman.
From a different party, too, by the way.
Well, from a different party, exactly. He invited Ford over. He gave him a personal tour of the White House. And he showed them where Margaret's piano almost came through the roof of the East Room. And Ford went away. And, it was just such a different climate in those days. 30 years later, in 1976, Bess Truman voted for Ford for president.
And she probably hadn't voted for a Republican ever. My next question was, it was simply Leslie Lynch King. Who? But
exactly.
Right, we would never know that name, of course, and no one really does. So what impact did this early sort of, this is a crude way to say it. What impact did this early sort of swapping of fathers have on Gerald Ford? And then the way I want to couch it is, had he been raised by Leslie Lynch King Sr., would he have become president?
We would never have heard of him. And he probably would have, I hate to say, wound up like Leslie Lynch King Sr., who was a scoundrel, to be perfectly blunt. The president said the one thing he inherited from his birth father was his temper. People didn't know because they haven't thought of, good old Jerry, the calmest man in the room. But the fact is, like Dwight Eisenhower, he had a fierce temper, and he spent a lifetime learning to control it. That was only, the least of Leslie King's deficiencies. Here's the remarkable sort of historical response to your question. In the 1930s, Ford was then a law student at Yale. He was doubling as an assistant football coach and scout, and managed to do both at once. In any event, his mother decided that she wanted, belatedly, to take his father to court for all those years of unpaid, court-ordered child support payments. And that's a story in itself. But fast forward, Ford's elected against the odds in 1948. He's an internationalist Republican, just home from the war, takes on an entrenched isolationist Republican in the primary, is elected in the fall. One of the first pieces of legislation he introduces would, in effect, federalize child support payments. Well, there was no way Congress in 1949 was going to do that. Fast forward a quarter century. This is what happens over and over again in the Ford story. These remarkable, I don't know if you call it coincidences. One of the first pieces of legislation that crosses his desk as president would, in effect, an updated version of what he had introduced in 1949. And he signs it. But here's the answer to your question. He never mentions a word about his personal, emotional investment in this legislation. Now, can you imagine a modern politician who would pass up the opportunity, quite frankly, either to
talk about themselves,
the public, or to exploit the situation, for its political advantage? But that was typical Ford. Ford had taught Sunday school as a young man in Grand Rapids. And in 1976, running against Jimmy Carter, all of his political advisors said, you've got to tell people about this. And he refused. because first of all, he was an Episcopalian, and there is a certain how shall I put it, chilliness, perhaps. He wasn't going to wear it on he wasn't going to exploit it. And that's one reason I would suggest why we don't know him as vividly as we know some of his contemporaries.
Mothers of presidents are really, really important. We learned that from Barack Obama's story. We learned it from Bill Clinton's story. Oftentimes there's a missing father for some reason in the lives of presidents. I want to ask about Dorothy Ayer Gardner. Who was she, and how important was she to the development and to the strength of Gerald Ford?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I think he felt he owed a great deal to her. And I tell you how I can illustrate that. It's interesting. Not long before he died, a nephew who had been tipped off to the fact that, you better get out here if you want to see your uncle. And he did, out there being Rancho Mirage, California, where the Fords spent the last years. This nephew asked him, Uncle Jerry, I'd really be interested in knowing to what you attribute your political success. And Ford thought for a moment, and he said, I made everyone's problems my own. Well, the interesting, and that's an interesting phrase. It kind of sticks in your head. I discovered he used the exact same wording in summing up his mother's approach to life. But at the same time, his sister-in-law was quoted as saying, Jerry's not demonstrative. And he attributed that to the family, including his mother, who, by all accounts, was a remarkable woman, a woman of great strength, great spiritual strength.
Willing to walk out on somebody who was abusive in a time where...
In 1913?
Yeah. Crazy, right? Amazing. Not crazy, but that's amazing. Yeah.
There was no reason to believe that the court system, would be in any way supportive of her.
Betty Bloomer. How did he meet Betty Bloomer? And what did she offer him that no one else could?
There is, I don't mean to jump ahead, but I'll answer this in the context of later on, people thought it was very odd that Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford in their later years should become such close friends. And one reason was all the things they discovered they had in common, which was very strong women in their lives, a very strong mother and a very strong wife. You cannot exaggerate the impact of Betty Ford. At the same time, you talked about being objective and in fact critical where it's called for. The fact is that Ford in his later years, I think, justifiably felt guilt about all those years when he was out on the road trying to elect Republicans. He was on the road 200 nights out of the year in the late 1960s when he was House Republican leader. That meant that everything fell on Betty. And it was at a time when her health was already beginning to deteriorate. She had rheumatism, she had arthritis, and quite frankly, when the doctors prescribed medication, and she took a drink or two, which she was wont to do while Jerry was out on the road, and the burdens of raising 4 children fell entirely on her. The combination was not a healthy one. And I think he, he never said this, but I think he felt a degree of guilt in terms of his own responsibility for a lot of the problems that she had, a lot of the challenges that she confronted. And that said, I think she's the most enigmatic figure in the book. First of all, the first chapter is called Secrets, which is a surprise in itself because people don't expect a book about Gerald Ford to have secrets. Well, she had her own secret. Her father, who was a traveling salesman, by the way, her first husband before she married Gerald Ford was a traveling salesman. And frankly, Gerald Ford was a traveling salesman. There is a pattern there. But anyway, her father almost certainly committed suicide the day before his 60th birthday. And it was one of those things that nobody talked about. Her great passion was dance. And she said 3 women really affected her more than anyone else. One was her mother, who was a formidable character. She was a suffragette who nevertheless insisted that her daughter wear white gloves when she went grocery shopping. When Betty was a child, she'd wander away at the camp that they had in the summer and endear herself to strangers who give her a cookie or brownie or whatever. And her mother's response was to hang a sign around her neck that said, "Please do not feed this child." Now, that to me is reminiscent of Eleanor Roosevelt's mother, who famously referred to her daughter as Granny. And interesting enough, one of the 3 women that Betty Ford credited with being the most influential in her life was Eleanor Roosevelt. And the third, of course, was Martha Graham, the great avant-garde dancer with whom, Betty studied for several years. But the key is she was good, but she wasn't good enough. And I think, personally, that one key to understanding Mrs. Ford and her vulnerabilities later in life was, I think, her mother planted seeds of insecurity in childhood. And I think the fact that what she wanted most in life passed her by, i.e., to be a professional dancer with the Martha Graham Company. She's a fascinating woman.
Let's go to some of the politics here. And the family stuff's all interesting, but I don't want to neglect the administration and the politics. So this is a Republican. I looked it up because I'm always curious about some of the landmark pieces of legislation that were passed by Democrats and I should say signed by Democrats, because in those days things were not as neatly drawn partisan-wise. But he was yay on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he was a yay on the Voting Rights Act. How did he view the major social programs and efforts towards social justice that LBJ
You have to remember, he was elected in 1948 as a liberal Republican. He had the endorsement of the United Auto Workers. And of course, part of that was he ran against this isolationist Mossback, in his own party. Now, interesting enough, over time, as he began to climb the ladder toward his goal of Speaker of the House, necessarily he became more conservative because he had to reflect a party that was always, frankly, more conservative than he was. Nevertheless, he worked closely with President Kennedy. They had been friends. They had offices next to each other in the House Office Building. And although they disagreed on domestic policy, they were as one on foreign policy. And they were Cold Warriors. Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, the whole generation of people just back from the war. They all came back, internationalists, if you will, and certainly dedicated anti-communists. So you had that element of consensus that is hard for us today to imagine. But in addition to that, Ford, well, great story, of course. When Ford becomes House Minority Leader following the Goldwater debacle early in 1965, one of the first invitations he gets is from a congressman, the first Republican congressman from Mississippi since Reconstruction. He wanted Ford to come speak to a fundraising dinner. Ford said, sure. He'd done 1,000 of those over the years. Well, then he got a telegram from Charles Evers, recently deceased, the brother of course, the late civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, who told Ford that this event was going to be segregated and he ought to think twice before he lent his prestige to it. Like a long story short, Ford undertook an independent investigation, discovered that that was true, made it clear that if he came to the event, he expected not only the event to be desegregated, but he expected tables to be racially integrated. And the long and the short of it is the event was canceled 2 days before the event. That was a gutsy thing for a brand new, elected by 4 votes in the Republican caucus. But that was Ford. You know, the great story, and forgive me, I tell stories, but the great story that goes to the heart of who he was, and it has a current, literally, we're waiting, as we have this conversation, we're waiting to hear the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action. The assumption is it will destroy what remains of affirmative action. Gerald Ford, as a former president, was the one person willing to speak out publicly on behalf of the University of Michigan's affirmative action program, wrote an article for the New York Times, which astonished some, appalled, quite frankly, some in his own party. But the article used a very personal example of his own college experience. His best friend on the football team was the only African American. And when Georgia Tech played Michigan, Georgia Tech made it clear they would not take the field if Willis Ward did. And Ford thought about quitting the team, and Ward told him, no, go in and play for me, beat the sons of bitches. And guess what? It was a horrible team that year that Michigan fielded. They were 7-1, but the one game they won was against Georgia Tech. And years later, first of all, Ford used his friendship with Willis Ward to illustrate in terms that everyone could understand what we would be losing if affirmative action went away. And even then it didn't end, because when Ford died, there was an effort to put his statue in the rotunda of the Capitol, one of 2 from Michigan. And the people who opposed it were conservative Republicans in the state Senate. And on the last day of the legislative session, the Democratic leader, African-American Senator named Buzz Thomas from Detroit, stood up without warning and said, I want to tell you something about Gerald Ford that you may not know. And he proceeded to narrate the story of Willis Ward and Gerald Ford. And then he said, and I just want you to know, Willis Ward was my grandfather. Well, the statue was in the rotunda.
Yeah, those are the magic words. So there's this neat little story that I guess has been kind of watered down as history has gone on now, 50 years since Ford became vice president, that Ford was needed to stop the bleeding, that if the Republicans could just find somebody who everybody could agree on, Ford would be an acceptable choice because everybody knew him and everybody found him to be, I guess, moderate enough, and also somebody who was at this point untouched by scandal. And it seems, by the way, that he's remained that way even through history, and even through history digging through all his papers the way you have. How accurate is that story? How neat is the story in reality of why Gerald Ford was picked?
It's absolutely accurate as far as it goes. The kink in the story is that Richard Nixon really didn't want Gerald Ford. to be
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Nixon wanted John Connally, who was his candidate to succeed him. Even after Ford, by the way, became vice president, he made it very clear to Ford explicitly that Connally was his candidate. And Ford said, that's fine. I have no intention of running in 1976. The only reason that Ford was nominated was because Nixon, who by that point was seriously weakened by Watergate, he really didn't have enough political capital. And there were not enough Republicans. He was being told by members of both parties. And remember, the Democrats had hefty majorities in both houses. So the fact of the matter is, they were going to determine who the next vice president was, or they at least could prevent someone they didn't want, like John Connally. And both parties made it clear. Nixon wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. What Nixon really thought about Ford, the closest I could come, I found a tape that I had never heard before or quoted before, in which Nixon says he describes Ford as an honest Truman. Now, you can interpret that in a number of ways. To most of us, it sounds like a compliment. Coming from Richard Nixon, it probably is not a compliment. Ford said later on it was the worst job he ever had because, being vice president under the best of circumstances is not fun. These were the worst of circumstances because Ford had to spend the next 8 months walking a tightrope. On the one hand, defending the president. On the other hand, not going so far in defending the president as to risk his own integrity. And throughout the whole 8 months, he could never acknowledge, even to his own family, let alone his staff and friends, that he might become president. The Fords may have been the only family in America in the summer of 1974 who, sitting around the dinner table, never speculated about the outcome of the Watergate affair.
We're going through right now a situation where a former president might be convicted of a crime, and there will be talk, no matter who is in office, that this president could be pardoned. What do we learn about what Ford went through with Nixon about lessons for today and how presidents should approach those who might be in trouble?
Well, first of all, I know there is a school of thought out there, and I understand it, that says, looking over our shoulders, if only Ford hadn't pardoned Nixon, then maybe this wouldn't happen. Maybe Trump or somebody else, would think twice before behaving in a potentially illegal manner. The problem with that is, I have to say, we elect our presidents for their judgment and for their willingness to make tough decisions. We don't elect them for their clairvoyance. What you got to do as a historian is peel back all of the intervening time and events and the conventional wisdom of our own time and try to immerse yourself in the autumn of 1974. Ford's in this job that he never wanted, that he couldn't prepare for. As Mrs. Ford said, usually presidents have 3 months, between election and we had 24 hours. And he is discovering every day a lot of things he didn't know. The economy is headed south. By the way, we're going through inflation much higher than we've experienced in the last couple of years, and that we think is terrible. The NATO alliance is fraying badly. There's kind of a stalemate with the Soviet Union. Anyway, we're still in Southeast Asia. All of these things are hitting him. And at the same time, he said 25% of his time was being spent on Richard Nixon's tapes and Richard Nixon's papers and Richard Nixon's legal prospects. Now, whatever it's worth, Ford, although he never said it publicly, personally, he thought that if the legal process were allowed to continue, that Nixon would be indicted and that he would almost certainly be convicted, at least on obstruction of justice charges. Here is the choice that Ford faced. He knew from well, one of the factoids in the book revealed for the first time. This is how Washington works. Ford's counsel, a man named Phil Buchan, his best friend, former law partner, was living in the Jefferson Hotel. Guess who else lived in the Jefferson Hotel? Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor. So there was this back channel between Phil Buchan and Leon Jaworski. Therefore, Ford knew from Jaworski it would be at least 1 year and quite possibly 2 years before Nixon could even be brought to trial. Well, you do the math. That's the rest of Ford's term as president. Ford had to decide. He wasn't forgiving Nixon. He was trying to forget Nixon. He was trying to change the subject, if you will, to refocus the public attention and the media attention. Because the media, this was the greatest story since sliced bread. I mean, this was, well, look what's happening today. All right. So in any event, Ford knew at the time that it would be politically damaging, perhaps politically suicidal. But the alternative was to remain obsessed with Richard Nixon. And that couldn't be healthy for the country.
I want to ask about the economy because you say something different from what lots of historians and at least what the conventional wisdom says, which is that Gerald Ford presided over a very difficult time when it comes to our economy, and that it really wasn't until Ronald Reagan, and some would say even until Bill Clinton, before the economy was really humming at full steam again. What's your argument about Gerald Ford on the economy?
Look at the numbers. What happened in the Ford presidency, first of all, was historically unprecedented. Today, we're sort of familiar with the term stagflation. Traditionally, the economy was a seesaw, okay? If you had inflation, well, you certainly had low unemployment. If you had high unemployment, you certainly had no inflation. Guess what? Because of the Arab oil embargo, which is something nobody had dealt with before, and a number of other factors, plus, quite frankly, Nixon, to get reelected in 1972, had put the pedal to the metal on the money supply for the Federal Reserve. Anyway, it all came home to roost in 73, even before Nixon left office. The fact is we had near double-digit inflation, near double-digit interest rates, big banks going under, and at 1.9% unemployment simultaneously. And nobody knew what to do because nobody had confronted this combination of disasters before. Ford made it very clear that the really significant thing about the Ford presidency in terms of economy, and it's a fundamental fork in the road moment in American history. With memories of the Great Depression fresh, in 1946, Congress had passed, and then Harry Truman had embraced the Full Employment Act, which made it very clear that in the future, unemployment would take precedence over, for example, any fight against inflation. The role of the American government with Keynesian economics, as a tool, was to keep unemployment absolutely uppermost, in part because it was politically devastating if unemployment reached beyond a certain level. Well, it had done so in the Ford administration. This was a man who had very little political capital to begin with, unelected president. He's damaged the capital he has by pardoning Richard Nixon. And oh, by the way, something we haven't mentioned, also even a partial amnesty, conditional amnesty for Vietnam War evaders. People forget that under Nixon, there was absolutely no chance that any of these guys would ever be admitted. And, as Father Hesburgh, who was on Ford's Vietnam Amnesty Commission, said, the difference is, under Nixon, these guys could rot in jail. He said the difference is between no chance and some chance. But the reason I bring it up is, even before the Nixon pardon, what did that do? it undercut Ford among what you and I would think of as his political base. And so he had already made a series of decisions that sort of reduced his electability, if you will, in 76. And he made it very clear, internally and publicly, that the fight against inflation was enemy number one. He would do the minimum necessary to convince people that he was also trying to wage war on unemployment. But first and foremost, it was, and out of that, by the way, one of the reasons why he embraced deregulation is because by fostering competition in the economy, guess what? You bring down prices.
Oftentimes, I fill our episodes with the historical topic at hand, and I don't want to ignore the history, but I especially want to take this opportunity to just ask you about your extraordinary career. And I think it's just rare to get a chance to speak with somebody who knows a president and was in the same room with them many, many times. So I want to ask, what was it like to be in the same room as Gerald Ford? How did he treat people?
Well, you saw, first of all, where the good old Jerry Monica came from. I found early in my research a really extraordinarily revealing thing that he had written. He'd been in Congress for 15 years, and it was advice to people who wanted to go into politics, do's and don'ts. And do go into politics if, most important of all, you like people. You can't fake that over a 50-year political career. Ford liked people. And it's interesting, I live in Grand Rapids, and although obviously his generation is thinned out, there are still, in the course of my research, almost every day, particularly since the book has been published, you run into people come up to you, and it's not a story about President Ford it's a story about Congressman Ford, who did this or that. And that's the way he was. There's a story that's not in the book that goes to exactly what you're asking. I was asked to be part of the very small group that were involved in planning his funeral. Basically, the military district of Washington is entrusted with this, but the family and friends are obviously have a part to play. And anyway, so we went out to Rancho Mirage. It was a day in January. And we were sitting there with both the Fords because we were going to look at both of their funeral plans. And I remember Mrs. Ford kept saying, keep it simple, think of the family. Anyway, we went through everything. The one thing he was adamant about, by the way, was he didn't want a horse caisson in the parade. He wanted his funeral to be more Truman-esque, if you will, than Reagan-esque. But anyway, at one point we had basically finished with work on his plans, and he was called away to the phone, and he came back 5 minutes later, and I'll never forget. He said, "Well, have you got me resurrected yet?" And we all laughed. But it was, first of all, it was illustrative of his sense of humor, but more to the point that he didn't take himself as seriously as you might expect, an elderly former president to do.
Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, and you. What was it like to give the eulogy at a presidential funeral among those four other speakers?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I'm not sure. Maybe some of your listeners have been in their own situations where, trying to get through a eulogy with a family member or a close friend. It's you're in a little bit of a fog. You desperately want to get through it without breaking down. And in this case, the Ford family was sitting 20 feet in front of me. And so, I
read the eulogy, by the way. It was really beautiful. I mean, awesome.
Well, thank you. And at one point, the thing that pierced that fog, I'll never forget. I don't remember much else in sensory nature, but I remember at some point hearing the very distinct sounds of a woman weeping. And I looked over to my right, and it was Rosalind Carter. And I thought after the fact, whoever would have predicted 30 years ago that this is how the story would end?
They were bitter rivals, and they became best of friends.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, there were a number of reasons for that. I mean, I think, first of all, the fact that they both run against Ronald Reagan, I suspect, helped to bring them together. But they were both products of a very, very distinct kind of time and place. They had a lot of shared values. I already mentioned the importance of strong women in their lives. They'd both come of age in the Navy. They even both had 4 children, including one daughter on whom they doted. The story of how they became friends, they had not been close while Carter was in the White House. Although even then, Carter credited Ford, at his request, with lobbying enough Republicans to approve the Panama Canal treaties, which, as you remember, were very controversial at the time. They became friends in 1981. You remember President Reagan sent Nixon, Ford, and Carter to the funeral of Anwar Sadat. And on the flight back, Nixon had taken off on his own. So it was just Carter and Ford. And they discovered, before they got back to Washington, how much they had in common. One of the things they had in common was, and by the way, people never stop to think about this, one of the first things that a former president discovers is he is responsible for raising millions of dollars to build his presidential library museum. That was something Ford had gone through. So he had that experience that he could share, not only with Carter, but with other former presidents later on. But before they got back to Washington, they had buried the hatchet. They had decided that they would do events at each other's presidential library. The wives became very good friends. And in fact, Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Carter made a formidable lobbying team. They would go up on Capitol Hill together and lobby, in Mrs. Carter's case, for mental health funding. And of course, in Mrs. Ford's case, for substance abuse and breast cancer. And the families became close. I mean, in a lot of ways, the Carter-Ford relationship paved the way for what might be an even more improbable late in life friendship between Bill Clinton and both Presidents Bush.
And Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, although while Clinton was still in office, which I think is super interesting. How has the art of presidential biography been impacted by this technological and information revolution that we're living through now?
Boy, that's a great question, and I can't answer it. I can give you a partial answer, which is, although I sound like I'm complaining by the sheer volume. For example, we haven't even mentioned COVID shut down the Ford Library for 2 years, which meant I got to 55 out of 66 enormous scrapbooks, the first of which were kept by Ford's mother while her son was a high school football hero. And then the last took him to his last days in the California desert. I got to 55 of them. Now, will they be available, for example, in a post-newspaper world? How will that information be assembled in one place? People don't write letters. People certainly don't keep diaries. So even if we didn't have the internet to complain about, which that's another whole story, the fact of the matter is, I do not envy tomorrow's biographers or historians, because what we have historically thought of as primary source materials will not exist, at least not in the form that
if your emails are locked behind a password, what do you do if?
Plus,
You know?
I don't know about you. This may just be my bias. I'm convinced that people communicate differently if they have 140 characters as opposed to writing a letter.
Of course. Yeah.
And so somehow that immeasurable factor will need to be taken into account by future biographers.
What I think is just awesome is that you've spent your whole life essentially doing this and trying to decode presidential history. And you give tours. I was looking at your website. You give tours through interesting places and regions of this country.
Back from 8 days with 8 presidents, mostly mediocre presidents in Ohio, Indiana. But
most presidents are mediocre to begin with. So you're I'm kidding.
There's something about the Ohio president, although they have great houses and great tombs because a disproportionate number of them died in office, and so school children in the 19th century would send their pennies, and these great monuments would be erected to presidents who have largely forgotten.
So let me ask though. So it's in some ways a job to you, but you just couldn't possibly do this as a job if you weren't fascinated by it. How does it remain so interesting to you, even after your whole life doing this?
Well, that's a great question. It's only in retrospect, that you can look back and see a pattern to your life. I mean, people ask me, what do I need to do to be a presidential library director? And I don't know how to answer that, or to write biographies, or I did some teaching along the way. It's only in retrospect, it all fits together. And what it is, for lack of a better word, I hate to use the word popular history, but the fact is, what used to be called the general educated reader, or even public intellectuals, and have largely disappeared today, because scholarship, like everything else about our culture, has become so atomized, so fragmented. It's like there's academic history and there's popular history. Well, why can't you have both? I mean, that's why David McCullough, was such a hero to me and to so many other people. So in any event, that, whether it's leading a tour that you mentioned, or writing a book, or giving a speech, or conducting a class, it's all the same thing. It's a passion that existed from childhood. I literally cannot tell you when it began. I know when I was 10 years old, I read a book called When the Cheering Stopped by Gene Smith, no relation, about the last years of Woodrow Wilson. Now, that book wouldn't be published today because it is overtly not only empathetic, but frankly sympathetic to Wilson. And it has almost nothing about Wilson's attitude about race. It has almost nothing about his abuse of civil liberties during World War I. I mean, all the reasons why Woodrow Wilson is very much out of fashion today. But nevertheless, it made the kind of impression that you think would be made on a 10-year-old. And it stayed with me, I suppose, ever since.
Dare I ask, can you begin to picture another project ahead?
I'm working on another project.
Oh, look at that.
And I know it's bad luck to talk about these things, but actually, I've got maybe one more book in me, and it's not a 10-year book. It's going to be a 3-year book, and kind of a fun book, intellectually rigorous, but hopefully entertaining. A big, opinionated, comprehensive history of the American presidency, with the working title of The Other Side of Rushmore. And the title sort of tells you everything you need to know. It's an against the stream treatment of the American presidency. I mean, I'm not at all unwilling to take on some conventional wisdom about the presidency or revisionist scholarship about the presidency. I have a chapter called "Would You Really Want to Be Stuck on a Desert Island with Theodore Roosevelt?" which
I hadn't pondered that, but maybe I will.
Well, stop and think. Anyway, that's what's next.
We'd love to have you back to talk about that, by the way, if you're willing.
Thank you.
2 more questions real quick. When you visit former President Ford's gravesite, what do you say?
Well, I can see it from my window.
What do you say when you look out your window?
Well, yeah, I can. I was writing at my desk, and I could look out the window, and I don't know. I mean,
You're there so often, I guess it's kind of.
Yeah.
Did that inspire you to write the book a little? Did that kind of impact the way you felt about him as you read the book, as you wrote the book?
I think actually it's a fair question, but I think to go back to what you asked at the beginning, I from the beginning, I think I have been almost hyper conscious of the need to be detached. But the trick to this, I've often said, is you want to be passionate about what you're doing and dispassionate about how you do it. And I think that sums up pretty well this book and all of the others that I've written. I am an incredibly lucky person. First of all, I'm one of those people, and our ranks are not all that great, who have, for whatever reason, been able to spend an entire lifetime doing not only what I like the most, but one of the few things I can do, because God knows there's a lot of things that, I can't drive a car, and on and on and on and on. So I'm very lucky to be able to have the opportunity to do what I've done for the last 60 years.
All right. Finally, your dedication knocked my socks off.
Yeah.
The words to Oliver Sipple.
Did you know who Oliver Sipple was?
I'm a bit of a dork, a bit of a nerd. I knew who he was. And actually we had a podcast. We had a podcast episode where he was brought up, but Oliver Sipple was the person who pushed the gun that had been fired that was headed towards Gerald Ford.
Yeah, was standing in a crowd outside the St. Francis Hotel on the 22nd of September, 1975. It was 2 weeks, by the way, after Squeaky Fromm had tried to kill the president in Sacramento. And a lot of people didn't want him to go back to California. And he was adamant that he wasn't going to be held prisoner. So he goes back. And the reason he came out the back door, ironically, is because there was a crowd out front the Secret Service thought was pretty ugly. And so they said, we want you to go out the back. And by the way, this time, don't shake hands. Well, right across the street, 40 feet away from the limousine, was this little crowd, and Oliver Sipple was there. He was an honorably discharged Vietnam veteran who had just happened upon this scene, and he noticed a middle-aged woman standing next to him with a handbag. And as the president emerged and he waved to the crowd, she opened the handbag and removed a .38 Smith & Wesson, and Oliver Sipple deflected her aim. The bullet missed the president, and she didn't get off a second bullet because of Oliver Sipple. And she was then tackled and so on and so on. Well, anyway, so of course the press alights on him. This is a great story. He's the hero of the day. And the day before he gets a thank you letter from President Ford, the San Francisco Chronicle takes it upon itself to out him as gay. And his family in Michigan disowns him. And really the rest of his life was defined by what should have been, a glorious experience. He died in 1989. He was 47 years old. And those who found his body noticed the walls of his apartment were papered with newspapers from that day in September 1975. And the place of honor on the wall was held by Gerald Ford's letter. And it just seemed to me an incredibly poignant story, a story that more people should know. And appropriately, in my opinion, again, because I knew the Fords, they had been very active. For example, they were among the first participants in the AIDS walks in and around Rancho Mirage and Southern California. And President Ford was the first American president, as an ex-president, to sign a petition for gay rights. He told friends several years before he died, and he died in 2006, so you do the math, that they should be prepared for same-sex marriage, that it was coming, it was inevitable. He thought it would be appropriate, and basically anyone who had trouble with it should kind of get over it. So knowing all of that, it seemed to me that Oliver Sipple was not the obvious to the public choice, but the most appropriate choice that I could come up with for someone to dedicate the book to.
Richard Norton Smith, the author of An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Thank you so much for being here. It really has been a pleasure to have you.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
Check out the book. Check out his website, which is richardnortonsmith.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We will see you next time. Thanks.